My name is Eve Bennett, and for 4 years I had worked my way up through the endless maze of projects, deadlines, and late-night calls at a tech company in Seattle. That morning was supposed to be my moment. I stood at the podium in the main conference room with a promotion certificate in my hand, the hum of polite applause still in the air, and the smell of fresh coffee from the catering table drifting toward me. My heart was pounding, but in the best way. I had earned this. Every weekend spent poring over contracts, every crisis I had quietly solved without fanfare, had brought me here. The double doors at the back of the room swung open and the mood shifted before I even saw who it was. Heels on polished floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm. I didn't need to turn to know it was Ryan Collins, the CEO's son, walking in with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Conversations trailed off, and I could feel every eye in the room pivot toward him. His navy suit was immaculate. His tie a little too perfect, like he had just stepped out of a photo shoot. He moved through the crowd without haste, nodding to a few people but barely acknowledging their presence. I kept my smile fixed, my fingers gripping the certificate so tightly the edges were digging into my skin. Ryan stopped a few feet from me, scanning the room as if making sure everyone was watching. They were. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of anticipation that makes you hold your breath. "Excuse me, everyone," he began, his voice cutting cleanly through the awkward claps that hadn't fully died down. "There's been a slight adjustment to today's announcement." My pulse stumbled. I glanced toward the HR director in the corner, but he looked at the floor. Ryan didn't even glance at the paper in his hand. After careful consideration, he said the senior project director position will require additional experience. I could hear the faint clink of someone's coffee cup being set down too hard. My stomach tightened as he turned his eyes to me, studying me like I was a problem he was already tired of solving. "Instead, Eve Bennett will be taking the assistant coordinator role." The words landed like a slap. My mouth felt dry, my mind scrambling to process what he had just done. A few murmurs broke out in the back, quickly hushed. 3 years of major launches of saving deals on the brink of collapse, all of it erased in a sentence. The certificate in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 10 pounds. The edges were cutting into my palm now, but I didn't loosen my grip. My face felt hot, though the rest of me was cold. Ryan smiled, a thin, almost bored curve of his mouth, like this was nothing more than a housekeeping note. "Congratulations again, Eve. I'm sure you'll bring your talents to your new role." He let the pause linger just long enough for the humiliation to settle in. Then he added, "Merit matters, but family matters more." The silence after was louder than any applause I had ever heard. I could see the discomfort on the faces around me. A couple of colleagues shifted their weight, others pretended to check their phones, anything to avoid meeting my eyes. My heart was still pounding, but now it was with something sharper, heavier than pride. It was the kind of moment you don't forget, the kind that doesn't just bruise you. It changes you. When I first joined the company, my title was so long and nondescript that it barely fit on my business card. I was one of dozens of mid-level project managers tucked into a corner cubicle with a second-hand laptop and a list of deliverables that looked impossible. My first assignment was to audit a failing product launch that had already cost us nearly $2 million in delays and miscommunication. People were already whispering about pulling the plug. I spent 3 weeks digging into every stage of the process, sitting with engineers, designers, and marketing until I found the problem no one had caught. A supply chain glitch was forcing us to ship with outdated components that overheated under certain conditions. Fixing it meant halting production for a month, but the alternative was a public recall. I made the case, got the green light, and watched the relaunch not only recover our losses, but turn a profit within the quarter. After that, people started coming to me with problems they didn't want anyone else to see. I was the one who quietly fixed the pricing error that would have cost us a key client in New York. I was the one who found the data entry flaw in our reporting system that had been skewing projections for 6 months. I wasn't flashy about it. I didn't push for credit in company memos or expect a parade when I closed a tough deal. My satisfaction came from knowing the solution worked, that my team could breathe easier because of it. While others networked at happy hours or played golf with executives, I was still at my desk refining proposals and running simulations. I didn't have a last name that meant anything in boardrooms. I didn't have an uncle on the board or a college roommate in the C-suite. Every step I took forward came from my own persistence and the fact that I never left a problem half solved. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady had built me a reputation. 2 years ago, the CEO called for a meeting about expanding into Europe. The idea had been floated before, but the risks always seemed too high. I took it home like a puzzle, pulling late nights, researching regulations, distribution networks, and consumer behavior across different countries. By the time I brought my ideas forward, I had a 60-page proposal detailing a phased market entry that minimized risk and maximized early revenue. I didn't just hand them a dream. I gave them a blueprint. That proposal became the backbone of what is now our biggest project in years. The European expansion was projected to bring in $50 million in its first year alone if executed properly. I worked every angle, negotiated with suppliers in 3 languages, sat through hours of legal reviews to make sure our contracts were airtight, built relationships with potential partners over months of careful, consistent communication. I knew the regulations better than some of the consultants we hired. I could recite tariff codes in my sleep. The deal had momentum now. The first shipments were already mapped out. I had secured a regulatory advantage most competitors didn't even know existed, a loophole that would save us millions in taxes if we moved quickly before the laws changed. Every decision, every piece of leverage had come from years of building trust with people who didn't have to take my calls but did because they knew I delivered. When word of my promotion first reached me, it felt like proof that merit could still matter here. I pictured my name on the director's door, not because of luck or bloodlines, but because I had earned it. I thought about calling my parents about telling them that all the times I stayed late or missed holidays had been worth it. Then Ryan walked into that room and with a few sentences made it clear that in his world, my work meant less than his last name. The injustice burned hotter because I knew what I had built. It wasn't just a promotion he took from me. It was the acknowledgement of everything I had done to get here. I left the conference room with my certificate tucked under my arm like a piece of scrap paper and headed toward my office. The hallway felt narrower than usual, every step echoing in my ears. My plan was simple. Close my door, take a breath, and figure out what comes next. That plan evaporated the moment I rounded the corner and saw Ryan sitting at my desk. He leaned back in my chair, one leg crossed over the other, scrolling through my computer as if it were his own. My monitor displayed the final version of the European expansion presentation. He didn't look up when I stepped in. His voice was casual, almost friendly, as he told me he'd be taking over the presentation for the European partners. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like handing a priceless watch to a toddler was a perfectly reasonable idea. I told him the files he needed were in the shared drive, knowing that wasn't entirely true. He clicked through folders with an air of entitlement that made my jaw tighten. This project had been my life for 2 years, and he was copying it onto a flash drive as if it were a few vacation photos. My mind flashed to the call I'd received just a day before from a regulatory contact in Brussels. She had confirmed that a key piece of legislation was being moved up for a vote in less than 2 weeks. If we didn't act before, then the entire strategy would need to be rewritten. That information wasn't in any shared folder. It lived in my personal notes, the ones I kept on my own account until I finalized them. Ryan stood tucking the flash drive into his pocket. He told me I could start moving my things to the assistant coordinator's desk. His tone was almost amused, as if this demotion were some kind of life lesson I should be grateful for. I watched him walk out without so much as a thank you for the work he had just stolen. The arrogance was so thick it left a taste in my mouth. I sat down at my desk and stared at the empty space on my screen where my work had been. The missing information about the legislative change hovered in my mind like a live wire. If I gave it to him, I would be protecting the project, the company, and the people who had worked beside me. If I kept it to myself, he would walk into that meeting thinking he had all the answers only to be blindsided by questions he couldn't possibly answer. The right thing was obvious. The smart thing was another matter. I thought about the years I had poured into this job, the times I had picked up the pieces after someone else's mistake, the promotions that had gone to people with the right last name instead of the right skills. I thought about how quickly Ryan had stripped me of the recognition I had earned. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I could upload the updated notes in under a minute. Instead, I closed the document and shut down my computer. The decision wasn't final in my mind, but the feeling was already there. I wasn't sabotaging him. I wasn't feeding him false information. I was simply keeping to myself what no one had asked for. If he wanted to claim my work as his own, he would have to own every part of it, including its weaknesses. As I left the office that evening, I wasn't sure whether I felt guilt or anticipation. Maybe it was both. Ryan walked into the boardroom like he had been born to own it. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary and carried my presentation in a leather folder as if it were his personal creation. The first few slides rolled out smoothly. He repeated my market analysis word for word, smiled at the right moments, and even managed a few jokes that drew polite chuckles. For the first 10 minutes, he was confident, polished, and entirely untested. The first crack appeared when a member of the investment committee asked about contingency plans if regulations shifted earlier than projected. Ryan's smile stayed in place, but his eyes flickered for half a second before he assured them there was no risk of that happening. I saw Henrik, the head of our European partner team, exchange a glance with his legal counsel. They were already leaning forward the way people do when they think they've caught something. Another question came about tariff adjustments on specific components. Ryan's answer was vague, leaning heavily on phrases like industry standard and reliable sources. The committee's pen slowed. Henrik's frown deepened. I knew they were all thinking the same thing. This information was stale. When Henrik finally asked about next week's parliamentary vote on cross-border digital commerce, Ryan blinked twice before insisting it was scheduled for next quarter. The silence after was sharper than any argument. Henrik's voice was calm as he said the vote was officially moved up. A few people in the room shifted in their chairs. One of the board members closed his notebook. Ryan tried to recover, but the confidence in his voice had thinned. His hands, which had rested easily on the podium, began to grip the edges. Each new question landed heavier than the last. By the time he clicked to the final slide, the energy in the room had shifted completely. The polite interest was gone, replaced by guarded skepticism. Watching him thank the room for their time, I could almost hear the sound of the floor giving way beneath him. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to shake hands. The board members filed out in a tight, silent line, their expressions closed. Henrik and his team left without looking back. The CEO lingered for a moment with Ryan, speaking in low-clipped tones before both disappeared behind the glass doors of an executive office. By the time I returned to my desk, the whispers had already started. The European expansion was being suspended until further notice. Departments that had been gearing up for the launch were told to pause all related work. The excitement that had carried through the company for months evaporated in a single morning, replaced by the kind of tension that makes people avoid eye contact in the hallway. My phone began buzzing almost immediately. HR, legal, the CFO, even my own manager who had barely spoken to me since the demotion. I let each call go unanswered. Messages stacked up one after another, notifications spilling across the screen. Every buzz felt like confirmation that the cracks were widening, and I didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. I opened my email out of habit and saw the same desperation there. Subject lines asking for urgent clarification requests for immediate meetings and follow-up questions about data points Ryan had fumbled. I read them without replying. I wasn't being petty. I was being deliberate. No one had asked for my input before the presentation. Now they wanted me to fix the mess they had cheered him into making. The noise around me built through the day like the low rumble before a storm. From my corner desk, I could see people hurrying between offices carrying stacks of papers and whispering in clusters. Ryan didn't appear again. The CEO's office stayed closed. I sat quietly, letting the chaos spin itself out, knowing the balance had already shifted. They just didn't realize it yet. I was halfway through a spreadsheet when HR appeared at my desk a little out of breath. "The board wants to see you right now." She didn't wait for me to answer, just turned toward the elevator expecting me to follow. I gathered my notes not because I needed them, but because I knew I would feel better walking in prepared. The executive floor was unusually quiet. Outside the boardroom, the CEO stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. Ryan wasn't there. A board member opened the door and motioned me inside. The long table was lined with serious faces. Henrik sat near the center, his legal counsel beside him, both watching me closely. The chair at the end of the table was empty. I took it. They got to the point quickly. Henrik asked if I knew about the parliamentary vote scheduled for next week. I told him yes. I explained that my contact in Brussels had confirmed it 2 days before the presentation and that I had not updated the shared files because I had been removed from the project. The room was silent for a beat, and then the chairman asked if I had that information now. I slid a folder across the table. For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through every detail, the specific clauses that would change. Despite the narrow filing window, we could still meet. The operational steps we would need to take within the next 10 days to secure our advantage. I kept my voice steady, my pace measured. The more I spoke, the more the room shifted. Pens began moving. Henrik leaned forward, nodding slowly. Even the sternest board members were making eye contact now. When I finished, the chairman set his pen down and asked the question that changed everything. Could I lead this initiative? I didn't hesitate. Yes. He looked to Henrik, who smiled faintly, and said he believed that was the right choice. Around the table, heads nodded. The decision was made in less than a minute. I was told to expect full access to resources and staff immediately. As I left the room, I saw Ryan standing near the elevator with the CEO. His face was pale, his expression tight. Later that afternoon, the company-wide email went out. Ryan Collins will be transitioning to oversee facilities management for our remote office in Anchorage. The announcement framed it as an opportunity to broaden his leadership experience. Everyone knew better. Back at my desk, I opened the project timeline and began making calls. The work ahead was massive, but for the first time in weeks, it was mine again. And this time, no one could take it away. 2 weeks after the project was back in motion, the board called me in again. This time, there was no tension in the air, only a quiet sense of formality. They offered me a role higher than the one I had lost, international operations director, with authority over every team working on cross-border projects. The title came with a larger office, a bigger team, and the freedom to set strategy without having to fight for every decision. News traveled fast. The CEO announced his resignation the same afternoon, framing it as an extended sabbatical. Everyone knew the European debacle had been the final straw. Henrik stopped by my new office later that week. He congratulated me and hinted that once our partnership was fully established, there might be opportunities on his side of the table. He said it lightly, but I could see in his eyes that he meant it. I could have soaked in the satisfaction of it all, and for a few moments I did. It felt good to have my work recognized, to have my judgment trusted by people who had once overlooked me. But as the first days in my new role unfolded, I realized this wasn't just about proving Ryan wrong or undoing an injustice. It was about finally stepping into the space I had been building toward for years. Every call with an international partner, every meeting where I set the agenda instead of following it, reminded me that the work itself was what I had always cared about most. Revenge might have been the catalyst, but it wasn't the reward. The real victory was knowing I had earned this position on merit alone, and that my success now had nothing to do with someone else's failure. When I locked my office that Friday evening, the city lights stretched out below like a map of possibilities. I didn't know if I would one day take Henrik up on his offer or stay to grow this role into something even bigger. All I knew was that the person who had walked into that podium weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone who knew her value and no longer waited for others to validate it. I found Ryan in the lobby on his last day, a single suitcase at his side. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from more than a lack of sleep. When he saw me, he didn't smile. He just asked if I had let him fail on purpose. I told him yes. I said I hadn't sabotaged him or given him bad data. I had simply kept what no one had asked for, knowing the missing piece would expose the gap between confidence and competence. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I reminded him that names can open doors. They can put you in rooms you haven't earned and give you chances others wait years for. But keeping those doors open requires skill preparation and the humility to know when you need help. That last part, I said, was what he had been missing. For a moment, he looked like he might apologize, but the words never came. He picked up his suitcase, wished me luck, and walked toward the revolving doors without looking back. Watching him leave, I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication, only a quiet understanding that I didn't need him to admit I was right. The best revenge isn't outsmarting someone in front of a crowd or plotting their downfall. It's letting them fail on their own terms while you rise on yours. Standing in that lobby, I realized I hadn't just survived what happened. I had used it to step into a place where his opinion no longer mattered. And that more than anything was the win worth keeping.